Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Glacial, the Inside Story of Climate Politics by Chelsea Henderson. Narrated by Sarah Welborn. Limit of liability, disclaimer of warranty. While the publisher and the author have used their best efforts in preparing this book, they make no representations or warranties with respect to the accuracy or completeness of the contents of this book, and specifically disclaim any implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. No warranty may be created or extended by sales representatives or written sales materials. The advice and strategies contained herein may not be suitable for your situation. You should consult with a professional where appropriate. Neither the publisher nor the author shall be liable for any loss of profit or any other commercial damages, including but not limited to special, incidental, consequential, or other damages. Author's note: 59 years of climate politics is a long period of time, spanning 11 presidents. With so much activity over so many decades, I did not have the space to dive deeply into any one era, each deserving its own account, its own book. For those who worked on particular bills or set of regulations, I'm sorry if I did not fully capture the extent of your hard work. But I hope I gave listeners who were new to the story of climate politics and these untold tales a glimpse into how hard it is to pass comprehensive environmental legislation and the dedication required to make progress happen. Prologue. At last. Holy shit, this is a ton of cash. Sam Ricketts, co-founder of Evergreen Action 2022. The sun shone brightly, but the humidity had waned, unusual for mid-September in Washington, D.C., a city often resistant to the crisp and clear-skied charms of fall. The lawn of the White House was flush with happy faces, the charge in the air electric with hope and relief amid the many pats on the back, more than a few self-administered. After all, this is the nation's hubris-laden capital for the celebration at hand. Finally, progress had been made on the long battle to address climate change. Progress that the 4,000 or so people in attendance could take anywhere from a sliver to the lion's share of credit for seeing through. In early August 2022, President Joe Biden had signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, of 2022, the largest and most comprehensive federal bill addressing climate change ever enacted. A bill that had withstood a roller coaster's worth of ups and downs and twists and turns, all at the behest of West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, a key negotiator and, as the one-vote holdout in a U.S. Senate split 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans, kingpin to success. The team of high-level White House officials, senators, and climate advocates negotiating the package had to appease the many demands of the conservative Democrat Manchin. Even though Democrats held the majority in the U.S. Senate, with no Republicans on board with the IRA package, there were no votes to spare. And the West Virginia lawmaker knew he had the leverage to kill the provisions he didn't like, as well as push for those he sought to protect his home state's legacy interest. Coal. Just a few weeks prior, Manchin, who in his first run for the Senate had aired a campaign ad in which he shot a bullet through a climate change bill, expressing his steadfast support for the Second Amendment and his disdain for coal-killing climate policies in one quick draw, had essentially killed the deal, deflating the spirits of exhausted Capitol Hill and White House staffers, as well as climate activists and concerned citizens. But shortly thereafter, he miraculously came back to the table to work with congressional leadership to hammer out the final details on a bill that provided an unprecedented infusion of cash into the U.S. transition to a clean energy economy. The IRA bill had fallen short of Biden's larger-scale Build Back Better plan that he'd promoted early in his term. Yet, the bill that did pass was still flush with investments in the future of renewable and clean energy, only failing to impose a cap on carbon emissions, a critical step toward ensuring that, along with an influx of renewables, the nation is also curbing fossil fuel use. But such a restriction wouldn't pass muster even with Democratic lawmakers, some of whom represent states essential in the mining or refinement of fossil fuels and others protecting their state's energy-intensive manufacturing. Thus, IRA didn't include many of the hallmark policies of past climate change bills. Bills that failed to make it through the coal barons of Congress, bills that failed to make it past powerful lawmakers like Joe Manchin. The IRA bill took a different approach, directing a whopping $372 billion federal investment in renewable energy and climate-related efforts to be spent on everything from research and development, R&D, to federal tax credits and rebates to incentivize a change in consumer behavior. Contrary to what the culture wars insinuate, there is no federal ban on gas stoves forthcoming, though there is a consumer rebate in IRA for those who transition from gas to induction systems. IRA's passage was a milestone, but the generous bill alone is not the silver bullet that will solve climate change. Even if the world stopped emitting greenhouse gases today, the Earth would not instantaneously recover from the damage done since the Industrial Revolution. In fact, our planet would continue to warm for decades, something scientists call committed warming. Climate change is already baked into our future, no matter what we do. For precisely this reason, the world needs to act fast. Climate change, also referred to as global warming, and in the early days of scientific discovery, the greenhouse effect, is caused by human-generated emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Those emissions primarily come from the combustion of coal and other fossil fuels to make electricity, are funneled into the atmosphere by the tailpipes of our cars, and emanate from industrial facilities that make products we cannot imagine life without. Carbon pollution acts like a blanket, holding in the heat of the earth. Those disputing climate change blame natural cycles as the cause of recent, unprecedented warming, but the pace at which the emissions of carbon and the average global temperature of the earth have increased tracks precisely with the advent of heavy manufacturing in the United States and other early industrial nations. There is no debate. A majority of climate scientists agree that human activity causes climate change, and the way to stop warming the planet is to stop burning fossil fuels. We need to create an abundance of renewable energy with an even greater level of effort than we've been putting into creating an abundance of fossil fuels, says top Biden administration Clean Air Act official Joe Goffman. Goffman has provided over 5 decades of valiant service to the legislative and executive branches of government, as well as the environmental community, through mostly thwarted attempts to solve the climate crisis. However, IRA begins the process of creating the renewable abundance long advocated by Goffman and his many peers and bosses over the years. The bill passed both chambers of Congress without a single Republican vote. Lacking 10 Republican senators to support the measure, Democratic leaders used a hyper-partisan process called budget reconciliation, a special parliamentary procedure of the Senate to expedite the passage of certain budgetary legislation by only requiring a simple majority, 51 votes, as opposed to the 60 normally required due to the filibuster. Unique to the Senate, the filibuster is a tool by which any one senator can hold up consideration of a bill unless at least 60 colleagues vote to cut off debate and take the vote. During these polarized times, budget reconciliation is the workaround to partisan gridlock, but only provisions deemed germane by the Senate parliamentarian can make it into the budget-focused package. With the Senate divided 50-50 in the 2021-2022 congressional session, Vice President Kamala Harris, in her procedural role as President of the Senate, had to cast the tie-breaking vote, the 51st yay vote necessary to pass IRA through budget reconciliation. Tie votes fail. Despite the partisan nature of its passage, enactment of the IRA bill deserved a party, one President Joe Biden was more than happy to throw for those who had toiled to make the monumental legislation possible. The public event dedicated to celebration of the groundbreaking bill was delayed a month to allow Congress to take its annual August recess, a month that also becomes the de facto month to take a vacation for anyone working in and around the political system. When at last the event was held in the White House Rose Garden, those assembled for the post-bill signing celebration included elected officials from the House of Representatives and U.S. Senate, congressional staff, environmentalists, lobbyists, corporate CEOs, and even songwriter and climate activist James Taylor, whose melodious notes hung in the air while younger generations in attendance questioned who the old man with the guitar was. Perhaps surprisingly, it was not one of the CEOs supportive of the bill who was tapped to introduce the President of the United States to the waiting crowd. Nor was Biden introduced by Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, or any other politician central to the achievement. The honor of introducing President Biden was bestowed upon Lovette Jacobs, a fifth-year member of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Local 103, an electrical apprentice and a member of both the Electrical Workers Minority Caucus and the Women's Caucus. Wearing a red polo shirt bearing her labor union's insignia, and a large smile after being herself introduced by Vice President Harris, Jacobs shared with the enthusiastic crowd how critical the election of Biden had been to ensure her job security, and how important her union job had been in her life. As we all know, plenty of promises are made around election time, the young woman said. Sadly, many of those promises are not kept. But not President Biden. When he got elected, he put his words to action. Unions build the middle class. He promised to be the jobs president. 2 years later, I think we can all agree. Promises were made, promises were kept. The Inflation Reduction Act won't just lower energy costs. It will create an untold number of energy jobs. It also comes with some of the strongest worker protections we've ever seen. President Biden knows we don't just need more jobs, we need more middle-class union jobs. Punctuated by claps and roars from the crowd, she continued, I'm proud to introduce the greatest champion of American workers, the 46th President, Joe Biden. A union representative lauding a president's efforts on a climate change bill would have been unthinkable at any other point in modern history. With labor unions and environmentalists, two major Democratic constituencies, frequently at odds and often putting Democratic lawmakers in a Sophie's choice position of having to choose one over the other. But the Inflation Reduction Act wasn't like any other climate bill, investing in clean energy, but also providing incentives for companies that pay decent wages and hire apprenticed workers. And the affable Biden, son of Scranton, Pennsylvania, a longtime senator from Delaware before serving as President Barack Obama's vice president, wasn't like any other president. Pro-union, pro-environment, pro-middle class, and with an empathy gene absent in most elected officials, Biden relished this role as the overseer of climate progress. The IRA crowd roared in appreciation as he took to the dais, signature aviator sunglasses on, suit jacket off, and full of the big grandpa energy he exudes in jovial moments. What a great day, he said, his smile as big as some of the egos present. Exactly 4 weeks ago today, I signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law, the single most important legislation passed in this Congress to combat inflation and one of the most significant laws in our nation's history, in my view. I said it then, and I'll keep saying it. With this law, the American people won and special interest lost. Say it again. The American people won and special interest lost. The same special interest, funded by fossil fuel companies that had stymied climate progress for decades. "It was by far the best day of my professional life," gushed a long-time congressional staffer whose career has spanned over 15 years working for the federal government on climate change. With the swipe of a pen, Biden became the only president to do what those before him had failed to achieve for over 50 years, making climate change a political priority. Not only that, but thanks to newfound strategic campaign skills executed by the environmental community, supporting climate change action no longer posed a political liability. The words climate change had grown to be deeply polarizing, largely due to a decades-long disinformation campaign funded by fossil fuel companies. Folks, for decades, climate deniers have blocked any meaningful progress in delaying and just pretending there wasn't a climate crisis, Biden said to the assembled revelers. "I remember back in 1989, I introduced the legislation about climate, but no one wanted to hear it." In the late 1980s, Biden had worked on climate change as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and his bill, the Global Climate Protection Act of 1987, he had the date wrong in his speech, but given the length of his political career and the countless pieces of legislation he'd co-sponsored, it's not an unforgivable slip. Set up a task force to plan how to mitigate global warming. The measure also called on then-President Ronald Reagan and the Soviet Union Secretary General Mikhail Gorbachev to bump climate change up to a higher priority on their diplomatic agenda, which the superpowers did. This year, the amped-up president said to the pro-IRA audience, "Nobody can deny there is a crisis. The climate crisis is real, and we're beginning to respond to it." The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 was a rare climate achievement to be applauded. But victory is fleeting, and the hard work of curbing the use of fossil fuels continues, as well as the battle against the generously funded smear campaign actively trying to undermine the effort. While momentous, this single act will not do enough fast enough to stop the climate crisis, leaving not just Americans, but the world at the mercy of the political whims of a country once the largest emitter in partisan turmoil. So, what's next? Americans can always be counted on to do the right thing once they've exhausted all other options, Winston Churchill once said. Hopefully, America has exhausted all other options because the global superpower's 7-decade track record on climate change isn't so great, and the clock is ticking fast. Presidents past passed the buck. In the last few decades, entire new categories of waste have come to plague and menace the American scene. These are the technological wastes, the byproducts of growth, industry, agriculture, and science. We cannot wait for slow evolution over generations to deal with them. The longer we wait to act, the greater the dangers and the larger the problem. President Lyndon B. Johnson, 1965. Lyndon Johnson, a startling briefing. On February 8, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson inadvertently made history, but not the kind that would be noted in textbooks. The tall, crass, undeniably strategic Texas Democrat who during his years as Senate Majority Leader embodied a style of physical politics heavy on intimidation and rife with favor trading, sounded a dire warning, the first in a long line of lawmakers to do so. Air pollution is no longer confined to isolated places, President Johnson said in a special message to Congress on conservation and restoration of natural beauty, delivered mere weeks after his 1965 inauguration. This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through radioactive materials and a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. Yes, LBJ in the 1960s, before words like global warming or climate change were commonplace vernacular, was the first commander-in-chief to warn his fellow Americans of a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. The president's special message focused heavily on natural beauty, not an easy thing to measure, and conservation. We must not only protect the countryside and save it from destruction, we must restore what has been destroyed and salvage the beauty and charm of our cities. His acknowledgement almost 60 years ago of the impacts of carbon dioxide emissions, given the subsequent decades of inaction, is enough to elicit forehead-slapping today, when near-unanimous consensus from leading scientists consistently informs us that human activity is changing the global climate and the world is careening toward cataclysmic consequences. James Gustav Gus Speth, a longtime advocate for action on climate change, senior advisor to multiple presidents, and founder of both the National Resources Defense Council and the World Resources Institute, wrote a book titled They Knew, the U.S. federal government's 50-year role in causing the climate crisis. The book is a gathering of the facts he assembled for Juliana versus United States, a climate-related lawsuit filed in 2015 by 21 youth plaintiffs against the United States and several executive branch officials. Speth states, "For at least 50 years, the federal government, all the way up to the White House, has understood the climate science and issued reports on the catastrophic dangers of continuing to burn fossil fuels. For 50 years, presidential administrations issued reports but were unable to negotiate substantive action. The first president to be briefed on the risks posed by unmitigated carbon dioxide pollution did what occupants of the White House often do when confronted with a new problem. He commissioned a report. Later, in 1965, the President's Science Advisory Committee issued Restoring the Quality of Our Environment, an all-encompassing look at the myriad environmental degradation issues plaguing the United States, from air pollution to water contamination, including a 23-page chapter on atmospheric carbon dioxide, the so-called invisible pollutant. Pollutants have altered on a global scale the carbon dioxide content of the air and the lead concentrations in ocean waters and human populations. The report, written by the nation's most prominent atmospheric scientists of the day, warned. Authors included Roger Revelle, one of the first in his field to study anthropogenic climate change and coiner of the term global warming, who, as a professor at Harvard University, would spark future lawmaker and climate champion Al Gore's passion on the issue. The chapter on carbon dioxide noted that, within a few short centuries, we are returning to the air a significant part of the carbon that was slowly extracted by plants and buried in the sediments during 500 million years. The prescient Science Advisory Committee report predicted marked changes in climate not controllable through local or even national efforts. Melting glaciers would lead to sea level rise. Warmer ocean temperatures would cause ocean acidification. Within a few generations, the climatic changes that may be produced by the increased CO2, carbon dioxide, content could be deleterious from the point of view of human beings. The possibilities of deliberately bringing about countervailing climatic changes therefore need to be thoroughly explored. Their report suggested that in the future, an alternative non-polluting means of powering automobiles, buses, and trucks is likely to become a national necessity. In the present day, all the signs of an overheated globe are here: blistering heat, the melting of the polar caps, destructive flooding, unending droughts, lower crop yields, disastrous wildfires, a lethal blend of perils to not only the environment, but to public health, national security, and the economy. In other words, the chilling 1965 report accurately depicted the crisis the world currently finds itself in, and the prospects spurred Congress to act. 10 years before LBJ's historic briefing, the Air Pollution Control Act of 1955, the precursor to the modern-day Clean Air Act, marked the nation's first attempt at regulating air pollutants. In 1965, House and Senate leaders, answering LBJ's call, spearheaded an effort to amend the law to enable cooperative action with other countries in addressing air pollution that crosses international boundaries. Senator Joseph Clark of Pennsylvania warned his colleagues that we poison ourselves with our own wastes by dumping into the atmosphere vast quantities of carbon dioxide. Some climatologists now tell us that the increase in concentrations of carbon dioxide in the air is actually altering the urban climate. Clark worried that without efforts to cap emissions, the amount of carbon dioxide in the air would double by the year 2000. In fact, it has tripled between 1965 and 2022. His delegation mate, Congressman William Green III, shared his concern. An original co-sponsor of the Equal Rights Amendment, an early supporter of the Voting Rights Act, the 26-year-old testified before a House Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee hearing that the increase in carbon dioxide in the air tends to raise the air temperature and may in time melt the polar ice caps. This melting would in turn raise the levels of the ocean, thus dangerously shrinking the Earth's land surface area. The solution? Congress amended the Air Pollution and Control Act with a provision that aimed to protect public health and welfare in other countries impacted by air pollution emitted in the United States, provided that the other country granted reciprocal rights to the U.S. The process was modeled after a similar, and not always effective, good neighbor provision used for interstate air pollution that involved convening a conference or set of conferences with the aggrieved parties seeking pollution abatement. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start, and it marked the first time Congress addressed carbon dioxide as a pollutant. President Johnson is most remembered for the Great Society, a set of social programs intending to address poverty, crime, the environment, and inequality, and the escalation of the Vietnam War. Often forgotten is his robust environmental legacy, which includes the Highway Beautification Act, a pet project of his wife, First Lady Claudia Lady Bird Johnson, after whom many median strips of native wildflowers are named, the Water Quality Act, the Solid Waste Disposal Act, and the Land and Conservation Fund Act, all precursors of today's environmental protection statutes, and all necessary to stem the rampant and careless pollution that was leaving rivers aflame and soil and water contaminated beyond so-called safe exposure. Culturally, in the post-World War II era marked by the advent of disposable everything and a stark turn away from the rationing imposed by generations prior, Americans weren't yet tuned in to eco-friendly tasks such as throwing garbage into a trash receptacle or curbing industrial pollution. LBJ started to change that, but sadly, the first U.S. president to be briefed by scientists on the dire threats posed by climate change wouldn't be the last. Not even close. Richard Nixon, the reluctant environmentalist. President Richard Nixon did not command the battlefield-tested and proven respect granted his former boss, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who preferred to be called the General rather than Mr. President. Nixon did not possess the handsome looks and blue-blood ease of his one-time rival, President John F. Kennedy. He wasn't politically confident or strategic like his immediate predecessor, President Lyndon B. Johnson. In short, the longtime politician who had served in the House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate as vice president, and as governor of the state of California before finally winning his dream job at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in the nail-bitingly close 1968 election, was not known for his charisma. He bungled any hope of a positive legacy with the infamous break-in at Watergate that forced his resignation in 1974, but ultimately did one thing right, He set the United States on a path toward environmental protection by enacting a suite of laws that remain the foundation of our stewardship today. In fact, Nixon's White House was a virtual hotbed of environmental activism at a time when the goal was shifting from conservation of natural resources to regulating the release of pollution. Over his 5+ years in office, Nixon signed into law the Clean Air Act of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?